This Filmmaker IQ lesson is proudly sponsored by Rode Microphones, premium microphones and audio accessories for studio, live, and location recording. Hi, John Hess from FilmmakerIQ.com, and today we'll look at the epic history of synchronized sound at the movies. Our story begins with one of the original American pioneers of film, the prolific inventor Thomas A. Edison. Now, Edison didn't invent motion pictures, but he did invent the phonograph in 1877, a device which could record and play back sound etched on a wax cylinder. In February of 1888, Edison attended a lecture by motion photographer Edward Muybridge, the man who first documented the gait of a galloping horse and the inventor of a very crude projector device called the zoopraxiscope. Afterward, the two men met privately. Why not marry the idea of Edison's sound recording with the hugely successful phonograph with the moving pictures of Muybridge's zoopraxiscope? There was just one major technological hurdle. There was no way of amplifying sound for large audiences to hear. The phonograph used large horns to direct and amplify sound, but this just wouldn't be enough for a crowded theater. Now, because of this problem, Muybridge abandoned the idea and returned to photographing his motion studies, but not Edison. Now, he believed the future of film was not in projection for large audiences, but in individual exhibition. Edison saw a future of coin-operated entertainment movie machines. By year's end, he had a crude design in mind and set his lab assistant, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, on the task of developing a machine that would be called the kinetoscope. In 1894, Dixon and Edison experimented with recording sound and images together for playback on a device that we called the kinetophone, a kinetoscope connected to a phonograph. Now, this film, restored and synced by Walter Murch in 1998, is the only surviving kinetophone film in existence, and it dates back sometime between 1894 and 1895. So from the very beginning, the design of motion pictures included the use of synchronized sound. Now, unfortunately, getting and keeping that sync was nearly impossible in these early machines. But the kinetoscope by itself did catch on. On April 14, 1894, Andrew Holland opened the first kinetoscope parlor in New York City, where for 25 cents you could get a chance to see 5 of Edison's peep show viewers. Now, though there was money to be made in arcade entertainment with the advancement of film projection, it was becoming clear that Edison was wrong about individual viewing and that motion pictures would find a home in the public theater exhibition. Again, sound faced the same technological barrier that had discouraged Muybridge from the very beginning. Now, other inventors did take a crack at the sound sync issue. In 1900, at the Paris World's Fair, 3 separate phonograph sync devices were exhibited: the phonorama, the chronophone, and the phonocinema theatre. But these sound-on-disc systems suffered from 3 major problems: sync issues if the stylus on the phonograph should skip a groove, amplification, and the fact that wax cylinders and later on 12-inch discs could only hold at most maybe 5 minutes of recording time. The marriage of film and sound would just have to wait. But in the meantime, film would go from an arcade novelty to a major international industry. When sound technology finally caught up, the movie business was a game of moguls and big money, with sound threatening to turn the entire industry on its head. 20 years after Edison and Dixon's first sound and film experiment, the movies were now a major entertainment outlet. But it's important to note that even though we call it silent film, it was never really silent. When the Nickelodeons gave way to the movie palaces around 1915, these large movie establishments would employ live orchestras to play music and add sound effects to the happenings on the screen. Now, some directors like D.W. Griffith even commissioned scores to be performed along with specific scenes in his film. But only the biggest theaters could afford such luxuries. Smaller venues would make do with a pianist, which was still a rather big expense. So now the effort was on to try to get pre-recorded music to go along with silent films so smaller theaters wouldn't have to pay for musicians. Well, instead of recording audio onto separate discs as Edison had tried, inventors focused on imprinting the audio right onto the film strip itself. In 1919, three German inventors, Josef Engel, Joseph Massoli, and Hans Vogt, patented the tri-ergon process that converted audio waves into electricity, which drove a light. This light would then be photographed on the film strip negative, the density being the strength of the signal. When played back, a patented flywheel would control the speed and a light would shine through the audio strip and onto a reader, which converted the light back into electricity and back into sound. Well, that solved the sync and length issues with sound on disc, but not amplification. That would be tackled by a giant in the development of radio broadcast, Dr. Lee DeForest. In 1906, DeForest patented the Audion tube, the first electronic device that could take a small signal and amplify it, a key piece in technology for radio broadcast and long-distance telephones. In 1919, DeForest's attention turned to motion pictures as he realized his Audion tube could provide much better amplification for these sound-on-film systems. Well, 3 years later, in 1922, DeForest had designed his own system and opened up the DeForest Phonofilm Company to produce a series of short sound films in New York City. Now, they churned out lots of these sound films, several 1 and 2 reel photo films a week, and by the middle of 1924, 34 theaters on the American East Coast had been wired for DeForest sound. Over 1,000 films were made in the span of 4 years, from vaudeville acts to plays to speeches from prominent people like President Calvin Coolidge, even this comedy routine from Eddie Cantor in 1923.
Good looking as I am, I get the homeliest girls. I just canceled a girl of mine, yes. Homely? Oh, you heard about people's faces being wrinkled? Hers was a court edict. And she had a very, very nice family. Of course, they had a lot of hard luck. Yes, her poor father, he died of throat trouble. They hung him. And her brother, lovely chap, but he's gone. Poor fella. With good behavior, he ought to be out in 1927 or 8. You know, he used to work in a bank, but no matter how much the boss likes you, you can't work in a bank and bring home samples. Oh, no.
But DeForest's success out east did not pique the interest of Hollywood. He had offered the technology to moguls like Carl Laemmle of Universal and Adolph Zucker of Paramount, but they saw no reason to disrupt the silent movie cash cow business they had with something as frivolous as sound. Well, that is until one studio took a gamble, going back to a sound on disc technology. Vitaphone was a sound-on-disc process created by Western Electric and Bell Telephone Labs that used a series of 33 1/3 RPM discs. When representatives tried to sell the technology to Hollywood in 1925, they faced the same disinterest that DeForest had. That is, except for one relatively minor but venturesome studio, Warner Brothers Pictures. In April of 1926, Warner Brothers, with the financial assistance of Goldman Sachs, established the Vitaphone Corporation, leasing the sound technology from Western Electric for the sum of $800,000, with the intent of subleasing it to other studios. Now, Warner Brothers never intended the technology to create talking pictures, instead using it to provide synchronized musical accompaniment for Warner Brothers films. To demonstrate their new acquisition, Warner Brothers launched a massive $3 million premiere in the refrigerated Warner Theater at Broadway and 52nd Street in New York City on August 6, 1926. Now, it was called the refrigerated theater because the movie theater was really the first time people of that era got to experience air conditioning. Now, the feature film at the premiere was Don Juan, with a lavish score performed by the New York Philharmonic, along with many sound shorts, including this brief speech from the president of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, Will Hayes.
Future of the motion picture is as far flung as all the tomorrow, rendering greater and still greater service as the chief amusement of the majority of all of our people and the sole amusement of millions and millions.
The premiere was a resounding success, with critics praising it as the eighth wonder of the world. Warner took the show on the road, hitting Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, St. Louis, as well as touring Europe. Now, despite the success, industry insiders weren't too sure about sound's future. You see, the entire economic structure of the film industry would necessarily have to change to adopt sound. New sound studios would have to be built, new expensive recording equipment installed, theaters would have to be wired for sound, and there was really yet to be a standard sound process. The star system, with actors trained in ways of pantomime, would be upturned, as now we would have to hear what they sounded like for the first time.
If we bring a little joy into your humdrum lives, it makes us feel as though our hard work ain't been in vain for nothing. Bless you all.
Foreign sales would plummet. Now, silent film title cards could easily be translated for export, but not dialogue, and dubbing a foreign language was still technology of the future. Even the musicians who found employment in the movie palaces would have to be laid off. For all these reasons, Hollywood hoped that sound would be a passing novelty. But the moguls began to move to protect themselves anyways. Lowell, which would become MGM, famous players Lasky, soon to be part of Paramount, First National, Universal, and Producers Distributing Corporation signed an agreement which can be known kind of confusingly as the Big Five Agreement, where the studios agreed to adopt a single sound system should an industry-wide conversion come to fruition. Now, meanwhile, Warner Brothers didn't halt on their Vitaphone investment. They announced that all of their 1927 films would be produced with synchronized musical accompaniment, and in April of that same year built the first sound studio in the world. In May, production would begin on a film that would cement sound's place in cinema, The Jazz Singer. Originally, The Jazz Singer was supposed to be a silent film with Vitaphone musical accompaniment, but Al Jolson improvised those famous words, and Warner Brothers left them in. Later, Jolson adds more dialogue in this tender and intimate scene where his character sings to his mother. As you can see, the film slips back into silent film title cards. Now, these two pieces of improv were the only spoken dialogue in the film, but the impact was enormous. This wasn't a speech or a canned performance. This was seeing actual drama unfold on the screen. And although synchronized sound had been around before, it was The Jazz Singer that was the first feature film to use it in such a realistic, almost voyeuristic way. The film went off to be an international success, earning $3.5 million worldwide. Now, at roughly the same time, Fox Film Corporation's William Fox, who was not part of the Big Five agreement, but a minor studio, much like Warner Brothers, saw potential in the talkies. In 1927, Fox acquired the Tri-Ergon sound on film process for $50,000 and began releasing newsreels with sound called Movie Tone. Now, these newsreels were a hit, and Fox began sending crews around the world to interview famous personalities on camera, pumping out 3 to 4 newsreels per week for Fox theaters. And a shrewd move, Fox negotiated a reciprocal contract with Vitaphone Corporation in which each studio would license the other's system, technicians, and theaters, thus covering both Fox and Warner Brothers should one sound system become standard over the other. by the end of 1927, it was becoming quite clear. Sound was here to stay. It was a dismal year for the industry. Only the sound films were able to attract and do big business. Even the worst sound film outsold the best silent one. The moguls were forced to act. With sound a sure thing, the studios began the process of picking a standard in accordance to the Big Five agreement, and there were a lot of optical sound on film options. While still pushing Vitaphone, Western Electric had developed their own optical system under Electrical Research Products Incorporated and won the contract with Paramount and Lowe's. RCA and General Electric had perfected a system called Photophone, and after narrowly losing the contract to Paramount, acquired Joseph P. Kennedy's film booking office, Pathé, and Keith Albee Orpheum to create the new major RCA-controlled studio, Radio Keith Orpheum, RKO. By the summer of 1928, every studio in Hollywood was armed with some sort of sound system license. Warner Brothers continued to lead the way, making the first 100% all-talkie, Lights of New York in 1928. It did so well in the box office that Hollywood insiders who thought silent pictures and talkies could coexist at least for a little while realized that silent film was all but dead. In 1929, 3/4 of all films made in Hollywood were released with some kind of pre-recorded sound, which included 335 all-dialogue features, 95 features with a mixture of dialogue and subtitles, and 75 features with musical score and sound effects. 175 silent films were released into smaller provincial theaters that had not been wired for sound, but even those were becoming more scarce. In just the span of 2 years, from 1927 to 1929, the entire industry was retooled from production to exhibition at an estimated cost of $300 million, more than 4 times the valuation of the entire industry. This money was lent from corporate Wall Street giants like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefeller Group, who controlled Western Electric and RCA. But the investment paid off in big profits as audiences came in droves to see the talkies. Now, it was because of sound that Hollywood was able to survive the first wave of the Great Depression that started with the crash of the stock market in October of 1929. Had it not been for the bold moves of Warner Brothers and Fox pushing the industry early on, the money required for sound conversion would have been delayed for at least another 10 years or so. And when the effects of the crash finally made its way to Hollywood in 1932, silent film was all but forgotten. Fox's Movie Tone and RCA's Photophone were the standard in the United States, and Tobis Clang Films' Tri-Ergon was the standard in Europe. Warner Brothers, who had made bank with Vitaphone, had plenty of cash to make the switch to sound on film. Sound was now commonplace in the movie theater, and it would take another threat to bring the industry to the next big innovation, the threat of television. The period from 1927 to the 1950s and early 60s is considered the golden era of Hollywood, the studio age, a rich period of mass production in which sound played a crucial role. With sound came the advent of the lavish musical and the familiar musical animation. The silent slapstick comedy of Chaplin and Keaton gave way to the fast-talking humor of the Marx Brothers and romantic screwball comedies. Horror gained a new ground, bringing in German expressionism influences along with eerie soundtracks. The first great horror icons, Dracula and Frankenstein, were all part of the sound era. Though the studios would experience ups and downs in the first 30 years of sound, major industry-shaking challenges were just ahead in the 1950s. First was the Supreme Court case, United States versus Paramount Pictures in 1948. The Paramount decision ended the studio's control over their own theaters, declaring the practice an illegal vertical monopoly. It also limited the practice of block booking, where studios could force theaters to purchase large blocks of movies, often bundling prestigious A pictures with a bunch of low-quality B films. Now, this effectively killed the studio's mass production mentality, bringing an end to the classic studio system. And then came television. Between 1946 and 1955, movie theater attendance plummeted, dropping 50% as suburban audiences decided they'd rather stay at home and catch the latest show on TV than make it out to the theater. The old way of doing business was dying, and innovative producers realized the only way to get people out of the house was to show them something you couldn't get at home. This is when we see the use of stereoscopic 3D, which led to an explosion in the widescreen aspect ratios along with huge projections, making the trip to the movies an experience. And to create that immersive feel came multi-track sound. For most of the studio era, sound was recorded and played back on a single mono track. 1940's Fantasia from Walt Disney would be the first film released with a multi-channel format called Fantasound. But only 2 theaters were equipped to play back that surround sound at $85,000 per theater. Well, who could blame them? But theaters in the 50s were desperate for something to draw audiences out. This is Cinerama in 1952, a bold new widescreen format that used 3 strips of film to create a 146-degree field of view, treated audiences to a total of 7 audio channels recorded magnetically onto the film strip. Exhibition placed 5 loudspeakers behind the screen, with 2 placed in the rear for surround sound. 20th Century Fox's CinemaScope also amped up the channels of audio to a total of 4, left, center, and right for loudspeakers placed behind the screen, and a 4th as a surround sound effects channel, which could be switched on and off with a 12 kHz tone to avoid unnecessary hiss when there was no surround sound present. VistaVision used something called Perspecta, a mono-optical track that could be directed to one of 3 speakers using a sub-audible tone. Now, to activate the left speaker, they would turn on a 30 Hz tone, middle a 35 Hz tone, and the right a 40 Hz tone. This really only worked for isolated sound effects and dialogue and was pretty much abandoned by the 1958. The large 70mm prints of the 50s like Todd A.O. also boasted a robust 6-channel sound. But the problem with many of these systems was they used magnetic strips that ran along the film. This added to the cost of the print and would wear down over time, resulting in little specks of iron oxide that would flake off and jam the projectors. Once Hollywood had settled into a new groove of filmmaking in the 60s, 35mm film with its aging mono-optical track became the go-to format. But audio technology progresses, and one company would forever change the audio landscape and become almost synonymous with movie theater sound. The story of Dolby and film theater sound really begins back in the 1930s. In the rush to equip theaters with sound, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences became an important technical resource for filmmakers and theaters on how to shoot and properly wire for sound. Consistency was always the problem. Big lavish theaters could afford great sound, while smaller theaters had to make do with less than stellar setups. In 1938, the Academy essentially standardized a frequency response, a sort of worst-case scenario which all sound mixing stages would have to be calibrated to so that sound editors would know what their mix would sound like even in the least capable theater. Theaters with good sound setups would have to handicap their setups to match this so-called Academy curve. To our modern sensibilities, the Academy curve killed audio fidelity, chopping off the highs and the lows. But it ended up doing one very important thing. It masked the high-range hiss that was so prevalent in the audio recorders of the day. But masking the problem doesn't make it go away. As music industry became more sophisticated in the 60s, recording artists turned increasingly to multi-track recording. Now, this high-end hiss became a serious problem. If noise was bad in one channel, mixing together 16 channels only amplified the problem. One engineer by the name of Ray Dolby came up with a solution. By splitting up the input signal into frequency bands and applying compression before recording the sound onto a tape medium, he could record a much better signal-to-noise ratio on the recording medium. For playback, Dolby would reverse the compression, and the result was dramatically reduced noise. This system, Dolby A, was introduced in 1966 and pretty quickly became the standard in the recording industry. Dolby's attention then turned to the film industry. In 1971, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange would be the first film to use Dolby's noise reduction on all magnetic generations up to the print master, though the final release print was still an optical mono track. But the cat was out of the bag. Academy curve was replaced the following year with Dolby's X curve, which is defined using pink noise and calibrated from a listening position center of the theater 2/3 of the way back, which incidentally is the best place to sit if you go to the movies from an audio standpoint. For the first time, sound engineers were calibrating speakers for the psychoacoustic response and taking into consideration the reverberation of any given theater size. Now, armed with noise reduction and new EQ standards, Dolby released a new audio system, Dolby Stereo, with the release of 1976's A Star is Born. Dolby Stereo sported 4 channels cleverly encoded onto 2 optical strips that ran alongside the film. The 2 channels are known as left total, LT, and right total, RT. A center channel was derived from everything that was on both channels, but down 3 decibels. A surround channel was recorded down 3 decibels on both LT and RT channels, so that one channel was plus 90 degrees and the other was minus 90 degrees. In 1977, Dolby Stereo would get its first real showcase in Star Wars, which did kind of okay at the box office. Now, Star Wars would go on to win a Special Achievement Academy Award for Ben Burtt in the sound effects department. A sequel later, before the release of 1983's Return of the Jedi, George Lucas and Lucasfilm got in on the movie sound business as well with the THX sound system. Now, THX wasn't a recording format, but rather a quality assurance system. THX certified theaters had to pass several rigorous criteria in terms of reverberation time versus volume, picture sharpness, noise limits, and screen properties, all for the honor of being certified THX theater and playing this sound effect dubbed Deep Note. Movie sound was serious business. In 1986, Dolby released Dolby SR, the second generation professional recording system with even better noise reduction and recording dynamic range, which gave engineers master recordings that were indistinguishable from live sound. 1987's RoboCop and Inner Space were the first films to be released with Dolby SR. Coming into the 90s, in 1992, Dolby released Dolby Digital with the film Batman Returns. Dolby Digital uses a 5.1 surround sound format with their AC3 compression algorithm. The digital data was printed in between the sprocket holes, and the Dolby analog tracks were kept as a backup for theaters that didn't have a digital reader. A year later, 2 new digital sound formats were also released, DTS and SDDS. DTS, Digital Theater Systems, premiered with Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, and almost a callback to Vitaphone using CD-ROM for audio playback, which was synced to a time code embedded on the film strip. Sony's Dynamic Digital Sound, SDDS, which premiered with The Last Action Hero, printed digital data on both edges of the 35mm print, sporting a 7.1 surround sound, the first format to exceed Cinerama in terms of audio channels. As we move into digital projection, the audio component is simply embedded as a file with the digital package. Current digital cinema formats are able to handle upwards of 16 channels of audio, and the always forward-thinking Japanese broadcasting service NHK has even debuted their 8K projection with an astounding 22.1 channel surround sound. What industry insiders thought was a novelty in 1927 is now, in the words of Spielberg, half the picture. Cinema and moving pictures have this amazing grip on our collective psyche. It's more than just merely entertainment or frivolous escapism. At the core, these stories told through camera direction and performance remind us of a fundamental human fact, that you and I are not alone, that what we feel isn't only felt by you and me. that we are all on this human journey together. The act of storytelling, what may have started off as reenactments around a flickering campfire, are now reenactments on a flickering screen. And sound, to hear your fellow human beings speak, to hear the howl of the wolf, to hear the sound of the surf crashing on the shore. Sound was the final key to unlocking cinema's amazing power. No matter how you slice the history of cinema, it is a story of inventors and showmen, magicians and technicians, dreamers, and those with the courage to make those dreams come true. Make something great. I'm John Hess. I'll see you at filmmakeriq.com.